Vale, perdón, estoy gritando. Buenas tardes a todas y vamos a empezar con esta segunda jornada de este seminario en el que desde Sodepaz hemos querido un poco visibilizar la lucha de las mujeres palestinas desde diferentes ámbitos. Hemos tenido ayer a representantes de organizaciones de derechos humanos, de organizaciones de las mujeres, a políticas, y hoy seguimos con Xavier Al-Motme, que es profesora de la Universidad de Birzeit, y luego con una mesa redonda con Jaldia Bubakra, que es una activista de Palestina de toda la vida, y con Teresa Arangunen, periodista, y con Budur Hassan, que es abogada y va a intervenir por Skype. Vamos a tener ahora primero la ponencia de Samia y luego vamos a hacer una pequeña pausa a las 6 menos cuarto y a las 6 vamos con la mesa redonda. Y también agradecer a Esther Piñero y a Loreto Larumbe, que va a intervenir después para moderar la mesa, para su participación y para ayudarnos. Tanto Esther como Loreto han viajado con nosotros a Palestina, así que después del viaje han quedado enganchadas, digamos, a la causa y se lo agradecemos mucho. Pues por mi parte ya está.
Eskerrik asko, Laura, eskerrik asko guztioi, etortzeagatik. Tenemos con nosotras a Samia, que es profesora de Economía de la Universidad de Birzeit, en Ramallah, y participa en el Departamento de Estudios de Género de esta misma universidad. Es doctora por la Universidad de Londres, de la Escuela de Estudios Africanos y Orientales, en Economía Laboral. Hasta 2014 fue directora del Centro de Estudios de Desarrollo de Birzeit. Trabajó también como investigadora en el MAS, en el Instituto de Investigación Palestina de Política Económica, en Ramallah. Sus áreas de estudio incluyen la economía de género, economía del trabajo, política económica y desarrollo. Sus trabajos principales se centran en la búsqueda de desarrollos alternativos al neoliberal en Cisjordania y en Gaza, en el estudio de la economía palestina bajo la ocupación, en la viabilidad económica de la solución de un Estado y en la desigualdad de género dentro del mercado de trabajo palestino. Ella es voluntaria con el PAC-B, con la campaña palestina para el boicot académico y cultural a Israel, y hoy nos hablará especialmente de la explotación laboral de las mujeres palestinas en el marco de la economía colonial y de apartheid impuesta por Israel. Un privilegio para nosotras contar con ella y súper agradecidas. Cuando quieras, Samia.
To interact. As already noted, my presentation will be about the Palestinian economy with a particular focus on women. We've heard a lot yesterday about women's political involvement and the repercussions that women have to deal with as a result of their political struggle, their resistance. Today we complement what we have done yesterday by looking at a different sphere, which is the economy. And as it is very well known, the economy does play an important role in either liberating or reinforcing measures of oppression. And I will be looking at the issue of Palestinian women because the economy, together through a system, a very complicated system, has played an important and significant role in perpetuating, actually, colonialism. In a way, the systems that govern women's lives in Palestine from an economic perspective include three main systems. The colonial reality that both men and women live under, also the Palestinian government's neoliberal policies, and the third system that actually women have to deal with is patriarchy. So through the sort of interaction between these three systems, women have to maneuver in a way to survive, but also to challenge. So women have, instead of only two systems that men need to deal with, which is colonialism and neoliberalism, women actually have to struggle against three layers of systems, which is colonialism, neoliberalism, as well as patriarchy. So my presentation will actually explain how these different systems interact to make women's lives difficult, but also how women struggle and resist these three layers of systems to liberate themselves and their reality. I will first just talk about what do we mean by colonialism from an economic perspective. Colonialism is the set of policies that Israel has enforced on the West Bank and Gaza Strip since 1967. I mean, there are different levels and different types and different sorts of policies that Israel has introduced into the West Bank and Gaza Strip that actually shape the political economy reality. In terms of trade, Israel has in a way restricted our trade with the rest of the world, and we were allowed to mostly import from Israel. Our imports from the rest of the world were governed by Israel, controlled by Israel. In terms of exports, we had very little to export. We weren't allowed to export. So Israel controlled not just the borders politically, but Israel also controlled the borders economically. And this control was used to control the livelihood of the Palestinians. There were also very harsh and very strict regulatory framework for the productive sectors. And the productive sectors are known to be agriculture, manufacturing, and today we have a third sector that is considered to be productive, which is the IT sector. So these three sectors are basically the productive sector, and Israel has very diligently and very carefully controlled these sectors through a mechanism of regulations to prevent the Palestinians from growing these sectors. And I will explain why. Because these sectors are particularly important for women. Now, another layer of control that Israel controlled the Palestinian economy with is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is basically the collection of taxes and the spending. That's what fiscal policy is. We weren't allowed to collect taxes, and Israel was collecting our taxes and not spending these taxes on the Palestinians. So where our money was taken by Israel and spent actually on oppressing us rather than on making our lives, even everyday life, possible. There was also, as you know very well, and this has been articulated and written about extensively, the issue of natural resources, the land confiscation, water confiscation, the building of the settlements, the restrictions on the use of land, the prevention on the cultivation of crops and trees, the uprooting of trees. All of this has meant basically that the economic base for the Palestinian was very strategically and systematically targeted. These are colonial measures. These are measures introduced by Israel to contain our lives, to create basically dependency on Israel. So the aim of Israel was to destroy our capacity to survive economically, but at the same time created a dependency on the Israeli economy. And we will see how this actually impacted women very much more than men. So these colonial policies were very much relevant to women in a particular way. Okay, now after 1994, with the signing of the Oslo Accords and so on, all the sets of economic restrictions weren't really qualitatively changed. They changed somehow cosmetically, but qualitatively, in essence, in terms of their impact, they did not change. But there were actually more restrictive policies added to the colonial policies. These restrictive policies were very much that Israel remained in control of the West Bank and Gaza. But in addition to that, we have had a categorization of the West Bank territory into 3 separate areas, A, B, and C, each having different control by the Palestinians over various powers. Various powers, especially economically, it meant that the Palestinians had no control over Area C economically. Of course, security-wise, politically, it's something else. But economically, Palestinians had no control over the vast majority. More than 60% of the West Bank was out of the economic control of the Palestinians. I mean, what does that mean, that it was out of the economic control? It means that if you want to build a factory, that's impossible. You would need permits from Israel. It's subject to Israel's consent. It's subject to Israel allowing it to happen. If you want to even cultivate in very many of areas in Area C, it was restricted because Israel controlled the water. So all of that meant that basically Palestinians, through the peace accords, even lost control over more of their territory rather than controlled more of the land. So the peace accords didn't actually somehow enforce and institutionalize the colonial measures, rather than liberated us from these colonial measures. So we have had an expansion in settlements. We have had, the building of the apartheid wall, which basically, in addition to confiscating 10% of the West Bank territory, it confiscated more than 95% of the western water aquifer of the West Bank. So what was left of the land that remained in the hands of the Palestinians had no water to cultivate this land. So the building of the wall wasn't just about the confiscation of land. It confiscated natural resources that made it impossible for the remaining land to be actually utilized by the Palestinians. And then we had a labyrinth of bypass roads that were, built all throughout the West Bank. These roads are very much an apartheid system of roads. And they are called the apartheid system of roads because there's more than 700 kilometers of these roads. It's only Israelis allowed on them. So there might be a road that actually passes through your garden. And this happens in many of the villages. But you can't go on this road if you're not Israeli. So it's apartheid in the sense that it's an ethnic group that uses that road, although it's West Bank territory, but the Palestinians are excluded from using it. Of course, there are, checkpoints and roadblocks. All of these have worked to make economic life impossible. So Israel controls the borders, but with these systems of measures, you have had the internal economic life destroyed. Not just your relation to the rest of the world, but also your capacity to produce, to market, to input your production was also destroyed locally. So the impact of the peace process on the Palestinians economically, it was devastating. Gaza, the siege on Gaza economically, humanitarianly, in every way was devastating. The wars on Gaza brought the economy to its knees. And this is all post the peace accords. So all these colonial measures actually meant that the Palestinian economy was weakened, was extremely weakened. Adding to this, that the Palestinian Authority came with a set of measures that were neoliberal in essence. So we have a layer of colonialism, and then we have a layer of neoliberalism. And you, in Spain, have a taste of these policies. And the financial crisis that took place in 2008 are the result of these neoliberal policies, where people are allowed access to credit irrationally, where government services are reduced, where poverty becomes the norm, where public spending is cut. So in addition to colonialism, we have also this set of measures that were introduced by the Palestinian Authority, which are neoliberal, which basically created a divide in the levels of income. Predominantly, the Palestinians were middle class. After post-1994, they became very much divided as upper and lower class. And this very much has to do with these neoliberal policies. So this set of neoliberal policies, and as well as colonial policies, have resulted in a really problematic economic outcome. And the figure that I'm showing here, it's Palestinian gross domestic product, the size of the economy basically per person. And as you can see, it actually increases, decreases. And there is no other economy in the world that looks like this. This is extremely unique. Usually you have a very small change, either declining or increasing, but nothing like this. If we look at how this changes, if we look at, the change in the graph that I've shown before, this is how it looks. And we call this curve the yo-yo curve. The yo-yo because it keeps on going up and down, up and down. And as you can see, from a growth rate of nearly 15%, we go down to nearly minus 15%. This is unheard of. When your economy grows by 0.5%, the government goes on holidays with happiness. So imagine, this economy grows 15%, then the following year actually drops to minus 15%. Minus 15% is a total crash in the economy. The Great Depression that happened in the US in the 30s was 19% reduction in the American economy. That is still felt till today. So you have all this increase and decline in the economy, which means the economy is highly vulnerable. So all these measures that I talked about basically resulted in a very vulnerable economy. It resulted in a weak economy. It resulted in high dependency rates on Israel, and resulted in also dependency on the donor community. This is another graph which is economically very funny. As you can see, it doesn't make sense. This graph is basically a depiction of productivity in a country and wages. What has been happening in the world, and this happened in Spain as well, that productivity and wages usually, historically, should rise together. So when we produce more, there should be growth in wages. Now, what's happening in Europe is not the case. Productivity is rising and wages are declining. This is a trend in Europe since about 15 years. With us, there is no trend. As you can see, productivity has no relation with wages. This means that the economy is totally chaotic. It totally does not make sense. There isn't There isn't a problem here that I can say, wow, you know, it's like Europe. In Europe, there is a problem that workers work very hard and they get nothing. It's defined. Here, I can't even define the problem. I mean, wages are increasing, declining, productivity is declining. There's no relation between them. This means that the economy does not control itself. There is somebody else controlling the economy. Okay, so basically, the economy is highly chaotic. The relationships are very problematic. Productivity is very fluctuating. Wages are highly not following productivity. But we now turn to what all of this means to women. So all this chaos, all these measures, be it colonial or neoliberal, what does it mean for women's lives economically? And we start with the issue of participation, women's participation in economic life. And here the red line is men's participation, and the line below, the blue one, is women's participation. So this shows from 1994 till, 2 years ago, how men and women have been involved in the labor market. So this looks at basically women who are working, women who are unemployed as well, it's included. And you can see that the gap between men and women is huge. But that's not really the important point about this graph. The important point about this graph is that women's participation rate, Palestinian women's involvement in work, in the labor market, is the lowest in the world. So countries like Saudi, Afghanistan, Yemen, who tend to be more conservative socially than Palestinian society, women there are more involved in the labor market compared to Palestinian women. And this fact actually is paradoxical, does not make sense, especially that Palestinian girls in schools and Palestinian women tend to be one of the highly educated, most highly educated in the region. Our levels of education are only comparable to Lebanon. We have similar educational rates, which actually are at the top of the educational rates in the region. So why do Palestinian women acquire education, invest so much in their education, pay so much money, travel from their houses to universities, even travel abroad, but then they do not enlist themselves, they do not participate in the labor market? Now, many people said it's culture. You have a conservative culture, and you're conservative Muslims and Christians, you Palestinians, you don't like to get your women to work. But women are already in the public sphere. Women are already out there in education. They participate. All of yesterday, we heard all these heroic stories about women in politics. So they are already in the public sphere. But why aren't they in the economic sphere? Where are they? What are they doing? Why are Palestinian women hiding from the economy? So culture, if the answer was in culture, then Saudi should have lower participation rates because our society is not as conservative. If it was religion, then probably Afghanistan should have lower participation rate because they tend to be more religious. So for sure it's not culture, for sure it's not religion. Certain people suggested it's patriarchy. And of course, patriarchy is alive and kicking in Palestine. But also it's alive and kicking here. It's alive and kicking in Jordan. It's alive and kicking in Saudi. It's alive and kicking everywhere in the world. So it's not really the reason. So what is the reason for, women not being in the labor market? Okay, before I tell you the reason, I just want to, I'm just checking if you're still awake. Before I tell you the reason, I just want to show you another figure, which is the unemployment rates. Palestinian women suffer from very high unemployment rates. As you can see, men do have high unemployment rates, but over time they're declining. Palestinian women's unemployment rates are increasing. So, why is that? That's the, $1 million question. Any suggestions why it might be? Let's see. Come up with an explanation. You all have, one knowledge of the Palestinian economy or another. Let's see. Why would you, how can we explain this? Say that again? Occupation. Possible. Any other guess that we might have? Why are we hiding as Palestinian women from the labor market? No? Okay. You are absolutely right. Occupation, colonialism. It's at the heart of why women, it's not that women do not want to be in the labor market, it's women are...
Es solo el micrófono, solo si hablas sin micrófono.
Okay.
Okay.
What?
She can't hear what you say.
Yes, because nobody said anything. So yeah, of course. Yes. It's because, no one actually said anything. I would have explained if it had. So it's basically colonialism. Colonialism works in a fantastic way with patriarchy to prevent women from joining the labor market. And I will explain to you how. It's through the productive sectors. If we go back to 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip, there were meetings by the Israeli cabinet, the army people, together with the academics, together with the, all the sort of wings and sides of Israeli government came together to think about, what should we do with this bunch of savage Palestinians that we now, are ruling. And there were different propositions, different suggestions. One of them was that we should basically lock them up in their territories, they should basically manage their economic life. Another proposition was, no, we should actually keep them barely alive. We should let them survive, but we shouldn't let them survive in a way that we should not allow them to resist Israel, but let them survive happily. Another suggestion was that something between the two, and that we should let them survive, but we should be careful about not just the resistance, but their capacity to, over time, lose any way of trying to become strong, even economically, not only politically. These propositions were, very well documented. They're now coming from the archives of the Israeli government and so on. Now, the school or the strand of Israeli policy that basically won the day was the proposition that we should let the Palestinians survive, i.e., that is, Palestinian standards of living should remain okay, should be fine. So we shouldn't let the Palestinians live in absolute poverty. But at the same time, we should not let the Palestinians develop their capacities not just to resist, but also to produce. But why Israel was worried about production? Why Israel was concerned about production? Okay, I will not ask you because the translation will be a problem, but this is a lesson that Israel learned from other colonialists. Production is not an economic activity only. Production is an economic, political, and social activity. If you destroy production, you destroy the capacity of that society to survive, to become strong. This is a lesson that Israel learned from the British in India. This is a lesson that Israel learned from the French in North Africa. This is a lesson that Israel learned from apartheid South Africa. Destroy production for the natives, for the indigenous population. Then you can control that population easily, economically, politically, and socially. To bring it home to you, to give you an example, the EU prevents African agriculture from entering the EU, but with very high taxes. So Africa is much more proficient, it's much more efficient at producing agriculture. The EU, the 27 countries of the EU, block African agriculture. And the EU pays its farmers much more money to produce than to import efficient African agriculture. The EU does that. It's a loss to the EU economically, because the EU is paying more money. But why the EU does that? It does that because it protects the cohesion of society socially and politically. So countries, look at Trump at the moment. He's going crazy about the production sectors. China, all these countries, it's not just the economic strength, it's the political and the social strength. Israel understood that from history. It's a historic lesson. Hence, the most important economic decision that Israel came up with in 1967, destroy the productive sectors. Now, how are we going to let the Palestinians survive, because they wanted to provide us with a reasonable standard of living. How are we going to get our reasonable standard of living without production? Open the Israeli economy to Palestinian workers. This is how you provide better standards of living, especially for the uneducated, and at the same time, you do not actually have to spend any Israeli money on the Palestinians. So, Israel started in 1967 to destroy the agricultural sector. That meant confiscation of land, meant restriction on the uses of water. It meant that no subsidies were given to farmers, that land was even uprooting of trees. All of these measures weren't just to harass the Palestinians politically. They were meant to undermine this sector, because agriculture doesn't only put food on the table. It links you to your neighbor. It makes you work together. That's the importance of agriculture. By targeting it, you are actually destroying society. Same with manufacturing. Manufacturing, Palestinians weren't only not allowed to open new factories and start production, existing ones, we weren't allowed to import machinery. We weren't allowed to import spare parts for the machines that went faulty. measures of export and import. We weren't allowed, even when we produced, we weren't allowed to export. So all of these measures actually meant that people went away from the productive sectors. People left the productive sectors because you can't just work with no returns. And as a result, I mean, here you have some figures. Agriculture was about 34% of gross domestic product of the economy, in other words. In 1994, it was 20%. Now, at the time, about 40% of the Palestinians worked in the agricultural sector. In 1994, it was 23%. Manufacturing also declined. So these sectors declined over the years. Now, with the coming of the Palestinian authorities, these colonial measures were even more enforced by neoliberal measures. So the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund weren't very much in favor of production, because that basically conflicted with Israel. So resources were diverted away from the agricultural sector. So the Palestinian Authority used to allocate nearly more than 30% of its budget to security. The agricultural sector never received more than 1%. So we have Israel working at destroying the sector. After 1994, the Palestinian Authority continued with these policies through a different set of mechanisms, which is neoliberalism. Because at the heart of Palestinian policies was the directives of the World Bank and the International Monetary Authority, because they were the parties controlling the funding. So if the Palestinians went against the will of these two international organizations, you don't get the money. That's simple. So the sector kept on basically suffering. So after 1994, the situation became even worse for the sector. And here you see the contribution of both the manufacturing sector and agriculture to GDP. So Israel's policies of 1967 actually were fruitful, unfortunately. So these two important sectors declined. Here we basically, it's a graph of the employment in these sectors. As you can see, the employment in agriculture and manufacturing on the whole declined. Okay, if we look at women, this is basically the employment of women in the agricultural and manufacturing sector. Okay, so why are the productive sectors important for women? Because, we're looking at women here. Destruction of the productive sectors is particularly relevant to women anywhere in the world, not just in Palestine. Women everywhere in the world work in three main sectors. In the US, in Spain, in Tanzania, in Japan, it's the same story. Women work either in manufacturing, in agriculture, or services. There are hardly any significant number of women in construction. This applies to every country in the world. There are hardly any significant number of women in transport. There are hardly any significant number of women in all these sectors that are called male sectors. Of course, this applies to Palestine as well. Women, when they want to work, they either go to agriculture, manufacturing, or services. But what has happened to manufacturing and services and agriculture? They have been destroyed by Israel. So, Palestinian women have no place to be in the labor market. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they have no opportunity to work. if these two sectors are the sectors that employ women anywhere in the world, Israel targeting these sectors meant that women have only one sector to work in: services. And this is where you find Palestinian women, in services. As you can see, it's the only figure where the trend is rising. And of course, services is a female sector in Palestine. So colonialism and the destruction of the female sectors, basically manufacturing and agriculture, are at the heart of why Palestinian women are not in the labor market. It is not culture, it is not even patriarchy, it is not religion, it's not conservatism, it's colonialism that is basically at the heart of why women are not in the labor market, despite the fact that they're highly educated, despite the fact that they are engaged in political activism, despite the fact that they are there in the public sphere. So colonialism actually worked with patriarchy, because the division of economic sectors into male and female sectors is based on patriarchy. Now, patriarchy actually colluded, worked with, joined hands with colonialism. So women have had to not only deal with patriarchy, they had to deal with the repercussions of the joint action of patriarchy and colonialism to prevent them from joining the labor market. And that's why Palestinian women tend to have the lowest participation rate in the labor market in the world. That's why women are not in the labor market. In addition to women having basically no work, most of the work that they do, even in the services sector, what is the services? You work in restaurants, you work as a salesperson in a shop, also as a teacher, also as a nurse. This is the services sector. Most of the work in the services sector is informal. Informal means that it is not protected. So you do not have maternity leave, you do not have vacation, you do not have severance pay, you're not protected in any way. If you go to work, you get paid. If you do not turn up to work, either for being ill or for being busy or whatever, you do not get paid. That's informal work. Most of the work that women tend to do is informal. Most of it actually happens in agriculture and services that is linked to the settlements. Israel prefers to give work to women in the settlements for a number of reasons. They're cheaper in terms of their wages. So this is everywhere in the world. So women's wages are usually lower than men. It's just that by how much lower. So always everyone compares themselves to Scandinavian countries because they're like, the model example of equality. And they have a gap of 20%. The model example of equality have a gap in wages of 20%. So men in Scandinavian countries, which are the best performing in the world in terms of wage equality, their men's wages are higher than women's by 20%. Everyone else in the world performs worse than that. Now, for this reason, Israel prefers to employ women in settlements. So you tend to have not just exploitation of women in the informal sector within the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but also exploitation of women within Israel because they have lower wages. Now, work conditions for women are, especially in services and in the agricultural sector, are appalling. Women have to work for long hours, not knowing when can they stop working. Because, say, in the agricultural sector, you have to deliver to the market. And if you do not deliver by, say, 2-3 hours, the vegetables will be of less quality. So on some days, women have to work for 18 hours, 20 hours, and till actually they finish a certain field or a certain garden, and then return to their children. Very much of the time, their daughters have to take over the households. So you have women working in the fields, but then their daughters are having to take care of the families. So the exploitation is carried over generations, not of men, but generations of women. So this sort of complex relation between colonialism that exploits Palestinian women workers, who makes up for women's absence in the house, is their daughters. So their daughters have to become workers in the household. They have to take care of their, and this is not unique to Palestinian women. Of course, this exploitation takes place even here in Europe. It takes place in Latin America, in Africa, in many parts of the world. But for Palestinian women, the directions of exploitation are multitude, are various. So you don't have just Palestinian capital exploiting Palestinian women, you have Israeli capital exploiting Palestinian women. So, all parties are basically trying to exploit this low wage resource of people. There is also exploitation of women by Palestinian, what we call them middlemen, who recruit these women to work in Israel. They, of course, exploit both men and women. So Palestinian workers who want to cross to work into Israel have to pay these middlemen, we call them, a fee, a set of fee. Now, because men's wages are higher, the impact on men is lower. Because women's wages are lower, whatever this middleman charges has more impact on women. So women get not just exploited by Israel because they are given low wages to start with, they're exploited by the middleman. Their exploitation by the middleman also goes into other forms of harassment. This is a man in control of women. If you do not provide, if you don't come and help my wife, you're not going to get this job. They take liberty with exploiting women. Most of these women come, of course, from very poor backgrounds, but not just very poor backgrounds. Most of these women have their men in prisons. So they are having to fend for their households. They're having to pay for the survival of their households and their children by being exploited by colonialists, by capital, by middlemen. So the multitude of levels of exploitation are, huge in the case of women. This is a graph looking at the difference in wages between men and women. So you can see that on average, women earn much less than men. And what's even worse is that, as you can see, over time, the exploitation is increasing. It's not decreasing. So you see men's wages are rising, while women's wages are declining. So it's not that the exploitation just happened, it's becoming even worse, which is an alarming problem for the Palestinians. In a way, I mean, we do realize, of course, this problem. This is not a revelation, you know. This is not that, you know, it's, you know, me that found out this fantastic findings, and it's a revelation for us. This issue is discussed, is highlighted, and so on. And in a way, Palestinian policymakers cannot, because of their relationship with Israel and because of their relationship with the donor community, which is another problem, cannot very much change their policies. Because if they do change their policies, funding will be withdrawn. And this is why, for us as Palestinians, we try to devise mechanisms to challenge this situation. Not just for women, of course, but for the population at large. But because it touches the lives of women more, it is really more of a concern for somebody like me. I become more interested in because this is a multitude of levels of exploitation that falls on women. And one of the mechanisms for the Palestinian people, rather than Palestinian policymakers, to challenge this situation is the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And in a minute, Khaldiya is going to explain to us much more about the movement and its role and so on. But I just want to tell you briefly how engagement and your support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement actually challenges this situation. Now, what the movement calls for locally is to boycott Israeli goods and commodities, particularly in agriculture and manufacturing. And when you do boycott Israeli goods and commodities, you have to consume more local stuff. By consuming more local stuff, you're actually reviving, you're actually improving these sectors. By improving these sectors, you're creating jobs. Because these jobs are women-dominated, you are actually giving women more of a chance to be in the labor market. So for us as Palestinians, the BDS movement is not just a political movement. It's a movement that hits two birds in one stone. It actually allows us to challenge Israel's destruction of these very important, significant, we call them the base of the economy, the productive sectors, the manufacturing, IT, and agriculture. By boycotting Israel, you are giving more of a chance for local production. By giving more of a chance for local production, you are giving women more of a chance. So that's why the movement for us is extremely important on the very local economic front. And we have been seeing how more adherence, more acceptance, more practice of the movement locally has been having a positive impact on women. And this is why for us, I mean, politically, of course, is an extremely important movement expressing our struggle and our challenge and our resistance to Israel's colonialism, which Khaldiya will explain to us, more about that. But also from an economic perspective, it allows us to rebuild our economic cohesion to better resist Israel's colonialism. And that's why for us locally, it's extremely important to support this movement, because it works at many levels and when you boycott and apply pressure on Israel, that gives us strength to not just resist politically, but also resist economically. So, I think I should stop. Maybe I spoke for 3 hours. And thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Samia. Bueno, es el momento igual de hacer alguna reflexión, alguna pregunta, quien lo necesite, quien no pueda contenerse. Hagamos esto participativo, que seguro que lo agradece la ponente.
No questions, so everyone is...
They're just shy, don't worry.
Bueno, antes que nada, muchas gracias, muy clara la exposición y de mucho aprendizaje. Como mujer migrada y como mujer sindicalista en el País Vasco, recordaba unas jornadas de mi sindicato Comisiones Obreras, y donde veíamos la lucha de cómo las mujeres vascas han podido de una u otra manera fortalecerse paso a paso, y escuchándote cuando también en jornadas con mujeres migradas hablabas de toda la explotación, pero yo decía, si como mujer migrada nos sentimos así aquí muchas veces, estar en tu propia tierra, yo creo que es mucho más fuerte el dolor y la resistencia que estáis haciendo. Mi pregunta sería, ¿cuál es el mensaje a las mujeres sindicalistas en Euskadi, aquellos sindicatos que de una u otra manera, en este caso sería el hecho, la pregunta de ayer, ¿no? Hay un comité de empresa que está negociando o no el participar en la construcción del tranvía en Israel. ¿Cuál sería ese mensaje que le das a esas mujeres sindicalistas que están aquí y que de una u otra manera están intentando pues descubrir este nuevo mundo de toda la lucha de las mujeres palestinas? Gracias.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think it is very important to listen to the oppressed. I mean, be it migrant workers, be it indigenous populations, be it the natives, it's really important to listen. Because in a way, I think the first principle for solidarity is respect. And by respecting the voice of the oppressed, you're actually acting with a proper act of solidarity. And this is why it's important to listen to Palestinian women being exploited. And of course, I mean, in no way it is unique. It's just that the mechanisms are different, but exploitation happens to women everywhere. For those who want to stand in solidarity with us, we are saying that the challenge to colonialism is the answer. And at the moment, for us, the most important mechanism to challenge colonialism is BDS. So, because BDS works on so many levels, it's basically a mechanism. It's a struggle. It's an act of struggle that works for us. So, I would call upon you to challenge Israel's colonialism, not just by spreading the word and explaining what colonialism is about. I think it's important to inform, but I think it's more important to act. It's more important to take responsibility for your knowledge. It's very important not to be neutral. It's good to visit the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but you don't have to visit the West Bank and Gaza Strip to listen to the Palestinians. You know, when we stood in solidarity with South Africa, probably none of us had to visit South Africa. We stood with South Africa because human rights principles were violated, and we believed it's a universal struggle. It's the same with the Palestinians. And for us to tell the world about what happens in Palestine is important, but to actually engage in solidarity with the Palestinians, not to remain neutral, is very important. That is to, at the moment, BDS is one mechanism. So you should lobby your trade unions to take positions, to actually divest from companies that work with Israel. And trade unions have provident funds. Trade unions have finances. Where you invest these finances should be not just ethical on the basis of, environment, for example, or use of arms or so on, but also on the violation of human rights. So you should also not consume Israeli goods and commodities. You should not receive Israeli culture, because Israeli culture is manufactured to cover up all what I talked about. Israel is portrayed as a civilized, liberal country through culture. So by not receiving this culture, you are saying, I am not neutral vis-a-vis exploitation. I have a stance against exploitation, and I will not accept it. So work more on adopting mechanisms of resistance to Israeli colonialism, and you know better how to do it because you're in your own environment.
¿Funciona? Sí, vale. Yo tengo una que es muy concreta. La primera gráfica que has mostrado del desempleo, que aparecía en una línea ascendente en rojo de las mujeres y en una línea, no sé si descendente, pero de hombres por abajo, había como un punto muy crítico en el que el desempleo en las mujeres afectaba con especial, o sea, que empezaba a ascender y no paraba. Y si no me equivoco, porque no veo bien de lejos, creo que era como finales de los 90 o en los 90. Y yo no sé si es que los acuerdos de Oslo han influido especialmente en este aumento del desempleo en las mujeres.
Yeah, that's the graph you're talking about, isn't it? This one. No. Oh, you can't see it. What happened? Okay, because I have it here. Yes, I see. You're talking about the unemployment rates for men and women, and suddenly you have in 2000, actually it's after it's 2000 that unemployment rates for women started rising and have never stopped since then. It is because basically the colonial policies that were set by Israel were reinforced by the neoliberal policies adopted by the Palestinian Authority. So with the coming of the Palestinian Authority in 1995, after signing the Oslo Accords in 1993, Palestinian women joined the labor market more, thinking that they now will have a chance to work. But the reality on the ground basically was that the sectors they worked in were becoming even worse in terms of their capacity to employ. So you have more women joining and less work being offered to women. And this is why you have rising unemployment rates. Now for men, it stabilizes, rises, declines, stabilizes. So it goes with the economic situation. For women, it's always rising. So women had certain expectations with the coming of the Palestinian Authority that actually did not get fulfilled. In Gaza, you have unemployment rates for women reaching 70%. So of every 10 women who are in the labor market, 3 are only working, 7 are unemployed. And it's actually the highest unemployment rate in the world for women. In the West Bank, it's a bit less. The West Bank, because the situation is slightly better, but still, it's very high.
Buenas tardes. Bueno, antes que nada quería agradecer tus palabras. Me parece, realmente no he tenido mucho acercamiento al proceso de activismo allí, pero entonces tengo dos dudas encaminadas. Primero, en relación a cómo asumes la perspectiva decolonial o descolonial respecto al activismo, y otra, cómo se dan las relaciones de sororidad entre mujeres palestinas y pues en Israel, porque pues entendemos que la lucha contra el patriarcado, digamos, entre nosotras parte mucho de la sororidad, pero bueno, no me queda sonando de cómo se dan estas relaciones. Gracias.
So your first question is about activism and I didn't get your first question, sorry about that. And then your second question is about Palestinian women and Israeli women? Yes. If there are links between them? Okay, so I got that question. What was the first one?
En relación a la perspectiva, o sea, si se asume de manera decolonial o descolonial o descolonizar, o cómo es o sea, cómo se asume en el activismo esta perspectiva contra o sea, contra lo colonial. Sí.
You mean women's active role in resisting colonialism?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, is that or not? I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll answer yours.
Bueno, hablas de una perspectiva colonial, ¿cierto? Entonces, en Latinoamérica se aborda de colonizar, ¿sí? Como asumir otras maneras de ser, sentir y pensar, ¿sí? Pero lo que yo veo y lo que asumo en este ejemplo, en este caso, es que pues es una realidad totalmente distinta y la lucha no va encaminada, digamos, desde una manera macro, digamos, por ejemplo, en Latinoamérica se puede pensar como desde la modernidad, desde la colonialidad europea, ¿sí? Y de cómo resignificar sus prácticas cotidianas, digamos, desde los pueblos andinos, ¿sí? Pero acá lo que yo veo es que es una lucha y una cuestión que es contracultural, no sé si sería correcto decirlo, porque veo que es, no son dos perspectivas abismales, ¿sí? Sino es una misma perspectiva que en algún momento se divide y cómo se asume eso, o sea, cómo es descolonizar de cierto modo desde las mismas prácticas, según lo que veo.
Okay, yeah, I get it now. Thank you. Okay, a framework of decolonization. Actually, that's a very good way to frame BDS. It's a framework of decolonization because it tries to address the essence of colonialism, which is Israeli superiority in terms of, you know, how it views itself. So BDS in a way calls for decolonization based on addressing the unequal relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. And it tries to do that. I mean, I don't want to abort Khaldia's talk, but it's a framework that basically tries to tilt the balance. It tries to give weight to the Palestinians, to the agency of the Palestinians, the agency, our will to challenge Israel in order to acquire our rights. It gives us that power. So it actually empowers us more. It gives us agency, we say. This agency gives us more ability to challenge Israel. The purpose is not two cultures fighting. The purpose is that you have violations of the rights of the Palestinians. In a way, I mean, to bring it closer to you, it's a form of slavery, in other words. And this slavery has to be challenged not on cultural grounds. There was never a cultural issue. It's challenging the imbalance in power relations. The relation between the colonized and the colonizer is about a challenge of power. And you want to equalize the power of the Palestinians. You want to raise it. You want to improve it in order to bring about decolonization. And this is why the movement has chosen, the rights-based movement, because that actually empowers the Palestinians to decolonize, to bring about an end to Israeli apartheid. Now, what do Israelis have to do with that, especially Israeli women? They are acting really very logically like a proper colonial society. Proper colonial societies do not accept to give up their privileges. If you're Israeli, the resources that are taken from the Palestinians are given to the Israelis. The freedoms that the Israelis enjoy the Palestinians are deprived of these freedoms. So, in a way, there are very few Israelis that support our right for equality, for freedom from colonialism, both men and women. Very few of Israelis. Very few Israelis support what we call the decolonization process. Israelis, there is sort of a proportion of the Israelis that support the end to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. But for us, that's not decolonization. Decolonization is about tackling the Palestinian problem. And tackling the Palestinian problem does not limit itself to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The Palestinian predicament is the colonization of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, is what happens to the Palestinians inside 1948, is what has happened to the Palestinian refugees by their expulsion. This is for us how we define decolonization, by tackling the entirety of the Palestinian predicament or question. Now, the Israelis, be it men or women, that support this decolonization process are very few. At best, wouldn't be more than numbers on two hands. But they exist, they exist, there is hope. We work with these Israelis. I mean, we have no issue with culture or nationality or religion or ethnicity or race or, any of these terminology. We do have an issue with oppression, colonialism, exploitation. We do have an issue with that. Anyone who stands in solidarity with our struggle to end all these forms of oppression, be it Israeli, be it American, be it Spanish, we're comrades. We don't care about, we're not really, we don't categorize people as such. So I believe that the decolonization process that happens in Palestine, for it to work, it is not just the responsibility of the Palestinians and the 10-odd Israelis. It is really the responsibility of humanity, as very much was ending the apartheid system in South Africa, was each and every one of us responsibility. As very much the ending of slavery was the responsibility of humanity at large. Very much ending exploitation against migrant women at very many countries in the world. It is not the responsibility of these women. It's our responsibility as conscientious individuals and institutions. So taking up solidarity with Palestinians to decolonize, which is to the benefit, of course, of both the Palestinians but also the Israelis. When you stop the Israelis from exploitation, colonization, of course that's a win-win scenario for us all. So it is, I think, a struggle that we all have to engage with. And along the way, I mean, we do think, we do engage, you know, we do talk, and we improve our capacity to basically be more humane and more just and stand basically for universal principles. And this is why for us, we reached out to the rest of the world, but we reached out to sort of movements that are engaged in issues of justice. I mean, for you here, you're not exclusively interested in the Palestinian question. I'm sure all of you have other issues that you are engaged in. That's because it is not Palestine of concern to you, it's injustice that is of concern to you. And this is how it works. So decolonization within Palestine, I think very much is our all responsibility, as is any injustice around the world. Israelis, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but probably, you know, our relationship in terms of the decolonization process, their understanding, I mean, for us to label our decolonization attempts and limit that to ending the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is actually an act of colonization. It's an act of coercion. We define what are our rights and how we struggle for our rights. It is not the colonialist society that defines our rights. So we do take an issue with Israeli left that says your problem is the decolonization or ending the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. No, sorry, that's part of our problem. But the 6 million Palestinians who are refugees around the world, they are part of my problem as a Palestinian people. And so these are some of the, you know, the differences that we talk to the Israelis about. And, you know, for much of the time we've realized that colonial attitude actually prevails in the manner with which they have been dealing with us. This is why we took things into our own hand. We define our rights. We define the mechanisms of our resistance. Your responsibility is to stand in solidarity with that as Israelis. Very few Israelis accept that.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Sonia, otra vez. Thank you. Volvemos en 10 minutos con la mesa redonda. Os va a encantar.
خربت عليكي؟